L'kuta Sichos, Chelek Chavtes, the Sicha for Parshas Haazinu, Le'ilu Nishmis Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. This is a Rashi Sicha, very, very fascinating Rashi Sicha. As we go through it, we will see each detail in Rashi, how it is relevant and how it complements the rest of the Rashi, especially as you will see that the Rashi is actually a fusion of three different Pirushim. And the Rebbe will explain why they're all necessary and why they're all necessary here. I just wanted to, before the introduction that the Rebbe gives in Seif Aleph, I just wanted to give a pre-introduction, and that is that although we are now learning Parshas Haazinu, if we go back one parsha to Parshas Vayelech, in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, where the pasuk says, where Moshe says, "Leuchal oid lotzes velavoi," Rashi says, "Nitla reshus mizeh v'nitna lazeh." The permission, or the authority rather, was taken from Moshe and given to Yeshua. So that you have a pasuk where we see the beginning, or we see some level of transfer of authority from Moshe to Yeshua. Later on in Chumash, in Parshas Vayelech, there's a pasuk Vayelech Moshe v'Yeshua vayisyatzu b'oil moed. Moshe and Yeshua went, and they stood in the oil moed. Now the Gemara on that pasuk, as we'll see in the Sikha, says Shabbos shel diyuz gihaisa, that it was a dual Shabbos where both Moshe and Yeshua were serving as the leaders that Shabbos. So we already have two psukim in the beginning of Vayelech and in the middle of Vayelech that address the partnership, if you will, or the dual leadership of Moshe and Yeshua. Then we have our pasuk, which we're going to talk about today, which is in Parshas Haazinu, where it says Vayidaber Moshe es divrei Ashira hazois hu v'Hosheya bin Nun. So, and here Rashi is going to talk about Moshe and Hosheya bin Nun, or Yeshua bin Nun, as they come together as partners. I just want to point out that there's three different psukim that we're going to be talking about. Two are in Vayelech, one is in Haazinu. There is actually another pasuk in Parshas Pinchas, but I'm not going to mention it now because it's Pinchas is a little bit further away, so it's not as confusing. But to keep in mind as we journey through the Sikha, that there's two psukim in Vayelech that touch upon this Moshe and Yeshua working together. Then there's one pasuk in our parsha, which is going to be the subject of this Sikha. So that's just my introduction. Now, the Rebbe in Seif Aleph is going to introduce the idea that he's about to teach in the Sikha about Rashi's approach and what we can take from Rashi. Seif Aleph. Shingerat filmol as inyani shel Rashi v'Rushi alatera is v'Rashi alein gitaristam klal ani libasi el psudus omikra. It's been discussed many times in the Rebbe Sichos that Rashi's focus is pshat, the words of the pasuk. Unafilu in the Ertev u'Bashkafa Reshena Zait Uis as Rashi brings tam a drash shel Chazal, even in those places where it seems that Rashi is bringing a drasha, something deeper than just pshat. Aber kadai gezet men hat gebracht der drash oi bezagt nit auf dem wir besenu darshu vekayetz beza is mugach psudish mikra. Rashi brings a drasha, you will see that it's actually relevant to the pshat. Which is why Rashi brings it. Unless Rashi says the words v'rabbeseinu darshu, which darshu means a drash, then Rashi is telling us that it's a drasha and it's there for a reason. Either the Rebbe explains it, or we'll have to figure it out on our own. But that's v'rabbeseinu darshu. If there's no v'rabbeseinu darshu, and Rashi brings something that originates as a drasha in Chazal, it's because it is relevant to pshat. And das is nikir beif and beilit in Pirush Parshasenu, and we're going to see this in a very in a very open way in a Rashi in this week's parsha. Rashi sagt Pirush was wenn is me'ayin in the Mikairus von dem Pirush Zetman a dozainen drei besondere drashes in Chazal. Rashi is going to give us a Pirush that when you look in the sources, you will see that it's made up of three separate drashes of Chazal. Einer in Gemara, die zweite in Sifri, bei Parshas Vayelech, und beseif adrash versteht in Sifri al-Asar. One is going to be from the Gemara, one is going to be from Sifri in Vayelech, one is going to be from Sifri in our Parsha, in Haazinu. Bim Kairem haben die Drashas gescheichert nicht zwischen sich in their source. The drashas are totally not connected with one another. Aber Rashi b'Pirushi alatera is a ala mitzarif und kelel in ein Pirush. And Rashi goes and takes all these three seemingly independent commentaries and combines them into one Pirush. Therefore, we must say, as is zayin negiyat pshat hakasav, it does bin tzizamen, that they're all relevant to the pshat, even though they're drushes, but they're relevant to the pshat of this pasuk, which is what binds them together. And therefore also the order in which Rashi brings them, and Inyavas is in Pshuta Mikra, is also relevant to the pshat of the pasuk, as we will explain in the coming Seifim. So Seif Aleph is an intro that's telling us that although we're dealing with drashas of Chazal, nevertheless the fact that Rashi brings them, and the fact that Rashi brings them in one pirush, and the fact that Rashi puts them in this order is all relevant to the pshat of the pasuk. So now we're going to go through a few seifim in which the Rebbe is going to explore this Rashi and the sources of this Rashi, and then the Rebbe will explain it all to us in the most beautiful possible way. Is Rashi maitik from pasuk diveter hu ve'isheya benun? Rashi quotes the words hu ve'isheya benun unus mefarish, and Rashi says as follows: Shabbos shel diyuzgi haisa. It was a Shabbos of a pair. Nitla reshus mizeh v'nitna lazeh. Authority was taken from this one, meaning from Moshe, was given to Yeshua. Then Rashi says, Hamid le Moshe meturgaman. Moshe gave Yeshua, Hamid le Moshe meturgaman li Yeshua. Moshe designated a meturgaman, an interpreter for Yeshua, as was the order, as was the process in those days, that the teachers, or the main teachers, were given a meturgaman. They would give over, say, bullet points to the interpreter, and then the interpreter would teach those ideas to everyone. That way the leader, the main teacher, could teach so much more. Why, says Rashi, why was it given to Yeshua? Why didn't you raise your head in the lifetime of your teacher? Look, we never heard from you. We never heard from you before. Why all of a sudden now, after Moshe passes away, are you all of a sudden raising your head? And therefore, so people shouldn't say that Moshe started, Yeshua started, and Moshe gave him his meturgaman, his interpreter, during Moshe's lifetime. Then Rashi continues, why is Yeshua referred to here as Hosheya, a name that was originally his, but that had since been changed to Yeshua? To tell you that he didn't become arrogant about himself. Even though he was given greatness, he remained humble as he always was. So this is the Rashi. The Rebbe is now going to show how this Rashi divided into three sections, each section coming from somewhere else. The beginning of Rashi, where it says Rashi was a Shabbos of a pair, authority was taken from one and given to another. That's written in the Gemara Soita, Dafid Gimel Amud Beis. The middle of Rashi, where it says that Moshe designated an interpreter for Yeshua, Shteit in Sifri Parshas Vayelech, is written in Sifri and Parshas Vayelech on, I believe, on the pasuk Le'ochal Latzes V'Lavei. Unterteichen von Siyum Pirish Rashi V'Lama Keirei Kan Hosheya, and the end of Rashi, that why is he being called here Hosheya? Shteit in Sifri Parsha Seinu Ala Pasuk is said in Sifri on our Parsha on this very pasuk Hu V'Hosheya Binun. So the question is, why is Rashi combining three different statements into one pirush? And the question goes further. I can understand the first two items in Rashi. Aleph Shabbos Shal Yuzki, the number one, that it was a Shabbos of a pair, Moshe and Yeshua together, and Beis Hamid le Moshe Meturgaman le Yeshua, and the fact that Moshe designated an interpreter for Yeshua are somewhat thematically connected. The second item is also emphasizing how Yeshua was taking over as the new leader. Oh, but the end of Rashi, why is he being called Isaiah, is the Chelek is seemingly an entirely different thing to address. But not related to the previous idea. Not only does Rashi place it in the same Dibra Maschal, under the same heading, in the same Pirush, he actually connects it with a Vav, that connects the two. Villa Mokerikan. And why is it being called Hoshea? As if this question, why is he being called Hoshea, only comes up after we say Shabbos Shel Yuzgi Hamele Moshe Meturgaman. So in other words, first of all, there's a question is, why did Rashi combine all three? Second of all, the third point of Rashi, why is he being called Hoshea, isn't even connected in its idea to the previous two. The previous two are at least talking about Hoshea's leadership. Why is he being called Hoshea, Yeshua's leadership? Why is he being called Hoshea here? Seems like a totally different issue. Now, the Tmiya now, was Rashi is mitzad of drei besondere Yonim zusammen is noch größer. To enhance this question of Rashi taking three different ideas and combining them into one Rashi is even greater. Because not only are they three separate sources when you're looking back at where they come from in the teachings of Chazal and the teachings of the sages, nor Rashi allein bringt die erste zwei Maamorim b'makom acher, aber jeder in farzich. Rashi himself already brought the first two items in this Rashi in previous places, and in each place Rashi himself brings them independently. In Parshas Pinchas of Pasuk v'samachtas yodcha alav, sagt Rashi, in Parshas Pinchas where Hashem tells Moshe, you shall place your hands upon him, you shall give him smicha. So Rashi says, tenlei meturgman sheyidris b'chayecha, give him, Hashem is telling Moshe to give Yeshua an interpreter, so that way he could begin to speak, to teach during your lifetime. So the Yemru alav, so they shouldn't say to him, why didn't he raise his head during Moshe's lifetime? So this idea of giving Yeshua a Meturgaman is already mentioned in the Rashi, in Parshas Pinchas, without any of the other details that Rashi brings here. In other Parshas Vayelech and Pasuk, Leucha leid lasis v'lavei. So Rashi, Eni Rashai, shenitlo b'men Yerushos v'nitlo leYeshua. Moshe says, I cannot come and go. Rashi says, I'm not allowed to, because the authority was taken from me and given to Yeshua. So again, Rashi is bringing this idea in a different Rashi, independent of the other items that Rashi brings here. So even Rashi agrees that these ideas, number one, that the authority was taken from him, and number two, that Moshe designated a Meturgaman, an interpreter for Yeshua. Rashi himself agrees that they're not necessarily connected to each other. The proof is that Rashi himself brings them in two separate places by themselves. So if that's the case, what compels Rashi to combine them in this pasuk? So the overall question of Siv Beis is, why does Rashi combine three pirushim into one pirush? And this is enhanced by the fact that the third item seems to be totally disconnected from the first two items, and B, from the fact that the first two items, Rashi himself brought them elsewhere, independently of the others. So clearly Rashi sees them also as independent ideas. So why here does he combine them all three together? Gimel ich darf verstehen. The Rebbe continues to ask. Der Maimer, Shabbos shel de Yuzgi Hoysa, nitlo reshus mizev nitna lazeh, steht in Gemara benegeh an ander friedigen Pasuk in Parshas Vayelech. The Gemara, which is the origin, the source of this idea that it was a Shabbos shel de Yuzgi, that it was a Shabbos of a pair, and that the authority was taken from Moshe and given to Yeshua, the Gemara in Masechta Soita brings it on a pasuk in Parshas Vayelech, a different pasuk, an earlier pasuk than ours, where it says Vayelech Moshe v'Yeshua v'Yisyasu b'Oel Moed. Moshe and Yeshua went and they stood in the Oel Moed. So the Gemara brings on this pasuk, why are Moshe and Yeshua going into the Oel Moed? Because Shabbos shel de Yuzgi Hoysa, it was a couple Shabbos. V'Lecheira Rashi gedarf sagen dem ganzen Pirush of dem pasuk in Parshas Vayelech. So if Rashi is bringing the Gemara from this idea from the Gemara in Saita, then he should have brought it on that pasuk which the Gemara is talking about, which is earlier than our pasuk. Where it says Moshe and Yeshua. In our pasuk it says Hu v'Hoshea binun. But the first time it brings Moshe and Yeshua together in one pasuk is in Vayelach, and the Gemara on that says Shabbos Shel Yuzgi. So why does Rashi bring it there? Why does Rashi wait from all the way till Haazinu till our pasuk to bring up this idea of Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, which means that the Nitna Rishus Mizev and Nitna Lazeh was brought in the beginning of Vayelach. The Hamid Moshe Meturgeman is brought in Pinchas. So that is proving that they're independent statements, and the question is why combine them? Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, that Rashi hasn't brought yet. This is the first time Rashi brings it. But the question is, why is it the first time that he brings it? Why didn't he bring it earlier when the first time where it mentions Moshe and Yeshua together, and that is actually the pasuk that the Gemara is talking about? Men kennt nicht verempfern, als Jesu Rashi schon gebracht im Teichen von der Pirish Noni Parshas Vayelech, darf schon Rashi nicht übergasen in der Minyan noch einmal in Hemshech HaParsha von Parshas Vayelech Moshe v'Yeshua. So you may want to answer that part of Shabbos Shel Yuzgi is Nitla Rishus Mizev and Nitla Lazeh. The authority was taken from Moshe given to Yeshua, and that part Rashi did say in the beginning of Vayelech and the pasuk Yuchal Glosses V'Lavai. So maybe you could say that once Rashi already said that part, he doesn't need to say again. He doesn't need to say Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, because it's already understood from the earlier Rashi that the authority was taken from him and given to him. But you can't answer that, says the Rebbe. Because if that's the case, then we already know that Yeshua was operating together with Moshe. Then why mention it in this Rashi? is a moisif dominion for Shabbos Shel Yuzgi Haisa, and it's here where Rashi says more than just that the Rishus was taken from Moshe and given to Yeshua. He adds the word Shabbos Shel Yuzgi. It was a couple Shabbos. It was a Shabbos of a pair. So here Rashi's saying even more. So the question is, why does Rashi wait till now to say it? He's obviously not relying on what he said in the beginning of Vayelech, because then he wouldn't say anything here. So if he's not relying on what he said in the beginning of Vayelech, then why doesn't he say it as soon as he says Moshe Yeshua, which is the pasuk on which the Gemara is saying this idea of Shabbos Shel Yuzgi? Why does Rashi wait till Haazinu? Similarly, the fact that we're saying the middle part of Rashi. So in other words, the first Sif Beis, the Rebbe was focused b'chlal on this whole concept of Rashi combining three things. Now we're going through the individual things. In the first thing that Rashi says, Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, our question is, why does Rashi say it here and not earlier? Earlier, which is the pasuk of Vayelech Moshe of Yeshua in Parshas Vayelech, that's the Gemara says it on. Rashi should have said it there. Why does Rashi wait till here? Now we're going to the second thing that Rashi says. So we have a similar question. We have a similar question. Already in Parshas Pinchas we brought this idea of a Meturgeman. Over there, Hashem is commanding Moshe to give Moshe a Meturgeman, but to give Yeshua an interpreter. But certainly Moshe complied. So clearly, we know that Moshe gave Yeshua an interpreter. Why does Rashi have to say it again here? Das ist al derech, wie man gefindt bekamen, bekämen es auf Pirish Rashi. Als ein Inje, was hat mefarisch gewesen, in a friedigen Sefer, chazet dem Iber noch einmal in a Sefer Shlach. So maybe you could answer that the Rebbe has said numerous times in the rules of Rashi, that Rashi does repeat himself if the last time he said this was in a previous Sefer. Because sometimes from Sefer to Sefer, you need a reminder. So therefore, since the previous time Rashi said this was in Parshas Pinchas, which is in Chumash Bamidbar, now we're in Chumash Dvarim, at the end of Chumash Dvarim, so Rashi says it again. The Kosher came in the Dan was sich nicht wegen demselben Inyan bediuk. And certainly in this case, where it's not exactly the same thing. In Parshas Pinchas, in Parshas Pinchas, it's Hashem's commandment to Moshe to give Yeshua the interpreter. In Parshas Seinu, in our Parshas, it's talking about Moshe actually fulfilling this command that he gave Yeshua the interpreter. So even if you're going to say that's why Rashi is repeating it here, that A, because it's a separate sefer, and B, it's the next sefer, and B, because there is a little bit of a change, it's not exactly the same thing, is of a nitmuven, but still not understood. Why do we need to be told all of the details, including the reason that Yidden shouldn't say, why didn't Yeshua start this when Moshe was still alive? As the Rebbe has spoken many times, when Rashi does repeat himself, Zokter does nar bekitzer. He repeats it briefly. One of the Ertev where Zokter ibn mit alle pratim, and those cases where Rashi repeats all the details, is the farva does is muchrich mit the ksuv malasar. Is because it's necessary because of the psukim on here to repeat himself. So our question is why? Where in the psukim here is there a need for Rashi to repeat himself, and not just to repeat himself, but to repeat himself with all of the details, including the reasonings? Let's go back to Shabbos Shel Yuzgi for a second. We have another question on Rashi. The Mlashon Shabbos Shel Yuzgi touched up Rashi in Gemara. What does it mean Yuzgi? So Rashi translates the Gemara. Shnei Zugos, Shnei Chaverim Hayuba. It had two pairs. It had two friends, two colleagues. Tchilas Hayom LeMoshe, V'Sefer LeYeshua. In the beginning of the day, Moshe led, and then in the course of the day, the leadership was transferred to Yeshua. Was the pastors bavaron der Rashi as the Yuzgi can't the nicht geteilt werden kipsutim lashon zug. Why? What's Rashi explaining? That you can say the Yuzgi comes from the word zug, which means a pair. Warum the Nesius von Moshe is given betchilas hayom and von Yeshua besayfei, because Moshe led in the beginning of the day, Yeshua led in the end of the day. Says nit given an in von zug beide zusammen. They didn't operate as a pair where they were both leading together. Now this means the Shabbos was made up of two separate colleagues. So Rashi in the Gemara is saying, but it doesn't mean a pair mamish. It means there were two people that were involved in this. So that's what Rashi says over there, because according to the way Rashi explains it, it can't mean the simple meaning of a pair. Isn't it move on? But now we have a question. If Rashi has to clarify this to a 15-year-old a student who's learning Gemara, is pshita as a darf has turned in limud al pi pshat. So certainly for the 5-year-old who's learning chumash, who's learning pshat, certainly it should be explained. In other words, why does Rashi not explain to us what the Yuzgi means? Rashi says Shabbos Shel Yuzgi and doesn't explain himself. So these are our questions that we have on Rashi. Let's very quickly. Number one, why does Rashi combine 3 different pirushim into one? Number 2, why does Rashi not bring up the idea of Shabbos Shel Yuzgi in Parshas Vayelech, where it says Moshe v'Yeshua? Why does Rashi have to repeat himself about the Meturgeman if he already said it in Parshas Pinchas? And even if he does have to repeat himself, why does he have to repeat all the details? And number 4, why does Rashi not translate what the Yuzgi means like he did or in the Gemara in Masechta Sotah, Sif Daled. So in order to answer these questions, the Rebbe is going to point out 2 changes, 2 nuances where Rashi changes his words in comparison to the words of the Sifri, which are the source of the Rashi. Aleph, in Sifri state, Tenle Meturgeman Yeshua, Sifri says that Hashem said to Moshe, give him a Meturgeman, give Yeshua an interpreter, V'ushayel v'deirish, which will ask questions, which will expound, Umayre b'hayriyos, which will give rulings, B'chayecha during your lifetime, Ukashetifter, so when you pass away, Moshe, the Yidden shouldn't say, when Moshe, your Rebbe, was alive, you didn't speak anything, now all of a sudden you're speaking. So the Lashon in the Sifri, the words in the Sifri is, V'pirush Rashi, she'edoiris b'chayev, b'chayev rabach le'hayalach alaharim roish. Rashi says, why didn't you raise your head during the lifetime of Moshe your Rebbe? So Rashi changes from speaking to raising your head. So what? Obviously, if Rashi is changing, obviously there's a message there. The question is, what is the message in Laharim Rosh? Beis. When I get them town was ver da angeruf von Hosea, steht in Sifri lelamdecha tzidkasei shel Yeshua. The Sifri says that once this is to teach you the righteousness of Yeshua. Shemea ani shetzafa daitei alav. Shemea ani shetzafa daitei alav mishenitna b'rishus. I would think that once he was given this authority, this power, that his mind would overflow. It would get to his head. So he tells us, the pasuk, that Hoshea remained in his righteousness. Even though he was appointed a leader over the people, it was the same Hoshea with the same righteousness. Rashi sagt aber in ganzen anders. Rashi says it totally different. Even though he was given greatness, he lowered himself as he always was, or as he was in the beginning. So these 2 points that Rashi is changing from the Sifri are going to shed light on what Rashi is ultimately telling us here, and we'll ultimately understand that every detail of Rashi is necessary and interconnected, which is why Rashi combines all 3 pirushim, because they're all relevant here to this pasuk, and they all need each other. And let's begin from the beginning. Der Tam was Rashi sagt nicht dem Inyan für Shabbos und Yuski heute gleich in anderen Parshas Vayelech. Is weil dorten ist nicht talking erchlich zu sagen, als demot hat sich schon angegeben mit Peil und Süße shel Yeshua. Why does Rashi not bring, like one of our questions, the Shabbos shel Yuzgi earlier on in Vayelech? Says the Rebbe, because when you look in the Psukim, there's no compelling proof that Yeshua actually began operating as the Nasi. From Afapi as Rashi sagt, even though Rashi says that Moshe was saying, I can't lead because the Rishus was given to Yeshua, Rashi continues, Vashem Amar Elai, that Hashem said to me, Zehu Pirush, says Rashi. This is the explanation. Why is it? Why can't I come and go? Because Hashem said to me, you, Moshe, are not going to cross the Yarden. And Yeshua is going to cross the Yarden, and therefore he's going to be the next leader. Das heißt, so from this the Rebbe derives, that from this the Rebbe teaches, that Rashi derives, as the sinners of Yeshua is nit by Bayom. That the fact that Yeshua was given authority wasn't relevant on that day. Nor to leave them Inyan, Yeshua is being given the authority because he's going to be the one that's going to cross the Yarden. So when does his leadership become relevant? At the time when they cross the Yarden. So there's no compelling reason to say that when Moshe says, I cannot come and go, that's the time that Yeshua's Nesias began in actuality. No, the Rishus was taken from him. It was given to Yeshua that as soon as they get to the Yarden, Yeshua will take over. So Rashi is not going to say Shabbos shel Yuzgi, that they're operating in tandem, when we don't know for sure that Yeshua is actually Nasi. And so to the next pasuk, which we brought up when we said earlier, why does Rashi not discuss it there? Shabbos shel Yuzgi is in them as Yeshua is rein zusammen with Moshe and Eil Moed. Same concept. The fact that Moshe and Yeshua go into the Eil Moed, as Yeshua there's no indication that Yeshua is actually the Nasi over the Jewish people. That's a nor given a kiyum amida from the Mebishn. It was the fulfillment of Hashem's command to Moshe, call Yeshua, stand in the Eil Moed, and I will command Yeshua what it takes, what he's going to have to do to become the leader. But he wasn't the leader yet. So therefore, we asked, why doesn't Rashi bring this earlier? He doesn't bring it earlier because there's no proof in the pshat of those psukim that Yeshua had already taken over the position of leadership. He was being groomed for it. He was being taught that it's telling it's going to happen. He was being commanded about it, but it did not yet actually happen. But then when we come to our parsha, where the pasuk says that Moshe spoke, he and Hoshea ben Nun. So right away a question is raised. Was ist kavanas hakosov in mitzad of Zan Yeshua mit Moshe? Wie kommt da rein Yeshua Hoshea? Why does the pasuk include Yeshua? Who Hoshea ben Nun? It's true that Yeshua never left the Oyel, never left Moshe's tent. And Moshe was constantly with Moshe. Oh, but my time was finished. Why does it have to tell us here? We know that Yeshua was always there. All of a sudden the Torah says, Hu v'Yeshaya binun. Muz ben Zag, and therefore Rashi concludes, as the Werter Hu v'Yeshaya binun, but ziehen sich zu dem Vaydabers mit Chilas HaKasaf. That Hu v'Yeshaya binun is connected to the word Vaydaber. In the beginning of the pasuk, it does say, after the Torah tells us that Moshe relayed the Shira to the Jewish people, is the pasuk Meisif Huva Yeshaya Binun. The pasuk adds, it was him, Moshe, and Yeshaya Binun. The Shira gesagt, nicht place Moshe allein. Yeshua Binun hat es gesagt, not only did Moshe speak the words of the Shira, Yeshua also did, in a way that the people could hear him. Noch mehr, von dem was die Torah sagt, Hu v'Yeshaya binun, the way the Torah phrases it, it was him and Yeshaya binun. The lechem is the word Hu iberik, because grammatically speaking, the word Hu is unnecessary. Because it said Vayedaber Moshe spoke. So it could have just said v'Yeshaya binun. Instead, it says Hu v'Yeshaya binun. It repeats the word Hu. He and Yeshaya binun. Is moving as the Torah is the mit madgish as Moshe v'Yeshua and Dagven b'de gleich. The Torah is trying to tell us that Moshe and Yeshua were equals here. In the Minyan Vayif and Dibur Zeb, signifying the Nasi of Yisrael, in the matter that they were both speaking to the Yidden as Nasi. So, in other words, the Rabbi is telling us that Rashi is deriving from the fact that it says Hu v'Yeshaya binun. And the beginning of the pasuk it says Vayedaber, that the pasuk is telling us that at this point Yeshua began teaching the people. Yeshua became an equal to Moshe as Nasi. Und der Rebbe sagt, Rashi dafke do a Shabbos shel deyuzgi haisa. So this is where Rashi says that it was a Shabbos of a pair. When Rashi dafke, let's pause for a second, because here all of a sudden Yeshua is actually doing it. So all the questions, why doesn't Rashi say it earlier? Because earlier there was no proof that Yeshua was the Nasi. But here it's clear from the pasuk, the way Rashi learns, that he's speaking, he's telling the Shira to the Yidden together with Moshe. So Rashi says, Shabbos shel deyuzgi. And we ask the question, why doesn't Rashi translate the Yuzgi? One of our questions. The Rebbe answers, when Rashi darf nicht austeichen, was das meint. And here, Rashi doesn't have to translate what the Yuzgi means, because Kavanasi b'zeh is pshutik k'mashmoi, because Rashi means it in the most literal sense, as is seinen given, beide zusammen als Zug von Nesim, that they were operating together as a pair of leaders. It was in the Gemara in Saita, where Rashi says that Moshe was the beginning of the day, Yeshua was the end of the day. So they have to say, how can you say Zug? They weren't a pair. And therefore Rashi says it was two friends. It was, in other words, the Shabbos was made up of two people. But here where Rashi is telling us that Moshe and Yeshua were working together simultaneously, then the Yuzgi means a pair. There's no need for Rashi to explain something because it means what it says. Pshute kimashmai. And the Rebbe adds in the parentheses, in the brackets, what does it mean, the addition of Nitl Reshus? The mitmacht Rashi klar, because it says Shabbos shel deyuzgi, that they were a pair, and then it says authority was taken from one and given to the other. So the Rebbe is explaining that Rashi is clarifying. Dosa says the fact that he's going to say in a moment that the Reshus was taken from Moshe and given to Yeshua, it doesn't mean that was the end of Moshe's leadership. Noras is given in an Eifen von Zug, beide zusammen. That when he says diyuzgi, he's saying that although the Reshus was taken from one and given to the other, nevertheless they were still operating as a pair. But since Moshe was not the sole leader, in an Eifen von Daber Echad Ader, which usually we say there's only one leader per generation, and Moshe was not the one leader anymore because there was more than one. So we say that it was taken from him and given to Yeshua because the position that he once had as the sole leader was taken from him. But it doesn't mean that he was not a leader anymore at all. They were working together. So this is the first part of Rashi. There's three parts of Rashi. The first part of Rashi is addressing the fact that it says Hu v'Yeshaya binun. What does it mean? Hu v'Yeshaya binun, says Rashi. It must mean that they both spoke. They both spoke to the people the words of the Shira, which means that Yeshua stepped into the shoes of Nasi. And then Rashi clarifies that it was a Shabbos shel deyuzgi, that Moshe and Yeshua together were leading the Jewish people at this time. Now we have to go to the second part of Rashi, where Rashi says that Moshe gave a meturgamon, an interpreter to Yeshua. Now we can understand. Now that we understand what's happening over here, that Rashi is trying to tell us that Yeshua began his Nesias B'Poyel from this point. Now we can understand why Rashi has to say also the part that that Moshe gave Yeshua an interpreter, and doesn't suffice with saying that the Rishus, the authority, was taken from one and given to the other, as he does earlier in Vayelech. Well, and then from the pasuk, because the Meturgaman actually emphasizes the chiddush of this pasuk as Yeshua b'peil geret mit Yidden in themselves neifim v'Moshe Nesias b'peil, that Yeshua actually spoke to the Yidden just like Moshe would, that he became a nasi in b'peil in actuality. Yeshua gedarshan b'aznei am v'ya nasi darshan, that Yeshua spoke to the people as a nasi does mit a Meturgaman, with an interpreter. In other words, the whole point that Rashi is trying to make is that Yeshua began his Nesias B'Poyel. If he's a Nasi B'Poyel, he needs a Meturgaman. So Rashi says, Hamid leMoshe Meturgaman, in order to emphasize the fact that Yeshua is Nasi B'Poyel. So not only does this explain why Rashi is combining two things, he's combining two things, meaning to say that the Yuzgi and the Meturgaman, because he wants to tell us that he was a Nasi B'Poyel. It also answers the question why it has to say it again here and not to suffice what was said in Pinchas. Because there's a chiddush here over what was said in Parshas Pinchas. Meturgman far drashas Yeshua from Parshas Pinchas is not going to need for Nesias. In Parshas Pinchas, when Hashem is telling Moshe to give him an interpreter, before it actually happens, it wasn't as leadership. In Parshas Pinchas, the reason that Moshe when Hashem tells Moshe to give Yeshua an interpreter is so that the Yidden shouldn't claim after Moshe's passing that Yeshua is worthy of being leader. So therefore Hashem tells Moshe, give him an interpreter during your lifetime. Whereas here, Rashi is saying it as a continuation to the fact that it was a Shabbos of a pair, a dual Shabbos. Here he's leading the Yidden together with Moshe. Here the Meturgaman is being given to him as a Nasi. Until so much his Nesias is so real that he is actually a contemporary, an equal with Moshe Rabbeinu. So there's a much bigger chiddush here. So there's two-part question. Number one, why does Rashi bring it if it's disconnected, if it's a separate thing from the previous thing? And number two, why does Rashi bring it again if it was already brought in Pinchas? So the answer to the first part is, Rashi brings it here because it does connect. It emphasizes the fact that Yeshua is Nasi B'Peil, which is the whole point Rashi is trying to make in this pasuk. And the chiddush on Parshas Pinchas is that it was given to him as Nasi. In Parshas Pinchas, it's being given to him just to save face for him after Moshe passes away. But here, this Rashi, it's telling us that Moshe gave him the interpreter because he was becoming Nasi B'Peil. So in that case, why do we need to have the whole Kadesh L'Yemru Yisrael B'Chai Rabcha L'Hay L'Chal Harim Reish? Why does Rashi add that? And that was one of our questions. If we're repeating what it says in Parshas Pinchas, why does it have to repeat the whole thing with all the details, including the reasoning? Now, this question is a little stronger now, because we're trying to say that he's getting the Meturgaman as Nasi, not just to La'afuki the claims of the Yidden after Moshe passes away. So we still have to answer the question, why does Rashi add that detail, that the reason why he was given the Meturgaman was so Yidden shouldn't say, why didn't you raise your head during Moshe's lifetime? The Rebbe explains that in Siv Zayin. Aber Rashi kann sich nicht bestapig sein mit den Sagen, Shabbos oder Yuzgi Chulu, haben der Moshe Meturgaman. Rashi cannot stop there. Rashi can't stop there and say it was a dual Shabbos and Moshe gave Yeshua an interpreter. Why? Because at this point a huge question arises. Why is it necessary that Yeshua's Nesiah should begin when Moshe is still alive? Against the rule of the Gemara that there's one spokesperson, one leader. Rashi on the word dabar, even though it sounds like spokesperson, Rashi teaches manhig. That dabar means a manig. There's one manig for a doir. So all of a sudden, it's going to be a short period of time, but all of a sudden there's two leaders. Why is this being done this way? Now, once Rashi introduces the fact there was a Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, that Yeshua is given a Meturgeman, meaning Yeshua is acting as Nasi, even though Moshe is still alive. So the question that the Ben Chamish is going to ask now is, why are you doing that? It's true that Yeshua had to appoint, that Moshe had to appoint Yeshua. Aber was ist der Hechach, as Yeshua, Talmid Shel Moshe, soll führen Nesias b'chai Rabbi Moshe? But what's the necessity that Yeshua, who is the student, the disciple, should conduct himself as leader in the lifetime of his Rebbe? When a Nefe von Diuski betet zusammen in a way that they're both equals. Und nicht wie man sagt, we can find by anderen Mamalamokim from the Nesim Shilfneim, and not like we find in many successors of leaders before them, as the Nesias from Mamalamokim, that the leadership of the successor, even when he was the designated successor beforehand, it began after the previous leader passed away. Then the new leader comes in. Yeah, it could be that when the previous leader was still alive, he said, I want this person to succeed me. Fine. But when does the succession begin? After the leader passes away. Here, Yeshua is starting his succession when Moshe is still alive. And the Mechamish is asking why. After that, Rashi Mamshich. Therefore, Rashi continues, Shalei Yemru Yisrael, B'chaye Rabach, that the Yidden shouldn't say that in the lifetime of your Rebbe, why didn't you raise your head? And Rebbe explains, Dafke ba Yeshua not sich gefordert harame meyuchedes. Mitzadem was bechaye Moshe is dein ganze Anhage gewähren, akifun aufchi. But by Yeshua, there is a need for a specific raising, a specific bringing to attention, because during his lifetime he lived in the exact opposite style. Verkehrt betachlis von Neumim is total opposite of leadership, of being exalted. Verkehrt was bittul v'shiflus. He lived a life of bittul and humility. Kol muhusi is bashtanen in dem says Misharas Moshe. His entire existence was that he was Moshe's servant. U'misharas Yeshua nar leyamish. Yeshua was a youth. Meaning to say, the word nar, though it literally means youth, it means he was humble. He would not part from the tent of Moshe. And as Keseder gestanden in Atnua Fatachas Bittul, he was constantly in a mode of bittul, nar, meshares, like a servant, like a younger follower. The Gourarie brings that Yeshua was 56 years old. So nar doesn't mean a youth in age. It means a humble follower. Nicht wie mir gefindt der Dunge bei Aaron, der Afal Pivas Moshe gwen der Nasi, hat euch Aaron allein gelernt mit Aliden. Not like Aaron, for example, who despite the fact that Moshe was the Nasi, Aaron would teach Torah to the Yidden. Wie Rashi bringt in them say the Mishnah, as Rashi brings in where he describes the order of how Moshe transmitted Torah to the Yidden. Or by Yeshua, by Yeshua we don't find any leadership or any raising himself up over the Yidden. In other words, is not just, why didn't you start teaching? The Rashi is teaching, the Rebbe is teaching in Rashi that in Yeshua we never saw any revimus, we never saw any form of lifting himself up. And therefore, Yeshua needs a boost. Und derfahr hat man da beim Juchel mit Abwarnen, als Iden sollen sagen, Bechai Rabach lehoylech al harim reish. Hey, Jesus, by him had gefelt the Gamri, Haramas Reish Bechai Rabbi. Because by Yeshua there was no Haramas Reish whatsoever. Is that the far nit besukut sein, that's the Yisrael. So people would say he's not the kind of material, a person that could be a leader of Klal Yisrael. And this is, by the way, why Rashi changes from the Zoya, from the Sifri, instead of saying Medaber, he says Laharim Roish, because the whole point over here is that Yeshua needed a Haramas Roish. He needed to be lifted up. When the Riber Hamid LeMoshe Meturgman Yeshua Shederis Bechayev, that's why Moshe designates an interpreter for Yeshua, that he should darshan, that Yeshua should darshan in the lifetime of Moshe, so Yidden should see that he's capable of leadership. So in other words, the touch of the words is so much deeper now. It's like, why didn't you raise your head? It sounds like a derogatory way. The Rebbe is teaching verkehrt. Yeshua Take wasn't made in Rosh. Yeshua Take did not live in he was the closest thing to closest student to Moshe Rabbeinu. He was someone. He was a special individual, and yet you never saw from him anything beyond nar and misharis, anything beyond shiflus and bittul. And therefore, even though b'derech klal the seder is that you wait until the Nasi passes away in order to bring on the successor, the Memala Makim. The Rebbe in the Ha'ara says the word Memala Makim literally means to fill a space. Only once a space is empty is there need to fill it. Nevertheless, by Yeshua, there was a need to prove that he has the potential to be the leader because all his life he proved otherwise. Now we'll understand. That's the second part of Rashi. Second part of Rashi is the two parts. Number one, now Moshe gave him a turguman to emphasize to the Yidden that Yeshua is actually Nasi. And the second part of Rashi is that Yidden shouldn't say in other words, to say, to emphasize the fact that Yeshua by nature and by the way he lived his life was always with bittul, and therefore Moshe had to lift him up even when he was still alive to prove that he's capable of leading. Now we can go to the third part of Rashi. It's not even a question anymore. Now the third part of Rashi makes a lot of sense. When Rashi is medayik to sagen, he spiel asmek asher betchilosei, nit wie in Sifri hu Yeshua betzidkei. Now we'll understand. The shaila is nit stam l'makere Yeshua. The question is not why does he call him Yeshua. Yeshua. Seemingly the question is, look, we already named him Yeshua, why are we going back to an old name? If you look in the words of Rashi, the question is here, why was he called Yeshua? In dem pasuk. The Lechere Adrab, Dafki in dem pasuk is Masim is Omeruf and Yeshua. Rashi's question is going to be, and the Rebbe is going to explain it, that based on what you told me till now, and again, remember that at the beginning of the Sikha, the Rebbe said that the Vilama is this question arises only after the first two parts of Rashi. So the Rebbe is about to explain that based on how we now understand what Rashi is saying, now we understand why Rashi is asking this question. Here in this pasuk, why would you call him Yeshua? And the Rebbe explains. Since the whole point of this pasuk is to emphasize the fact that Yeshua began to be the Nasi, to lift Yeshua's head, so to speak, to emphasize the fact that he is now the new leader. Here, of all places, how is the pasuk using the name Yeshua? Which is the name that he had before he was named Yeshua. The whole reason he was named Yeshua was because when he was named Hoshea, he needed a special tefillah, special prayer from Moshe to be protected from the negative ideas of the Meraglim. So now, when you're trying to emphasize the greatness of Yeshua, you're going to go back to his old name, a name that represents his weakness. That's Rashi's question. Here, where the whole purpose of the pasuk, based on what you told me in the beginning of Rashi, in the first two parts of Rashi, that the whole point of this pasuk is to elevate Yeshua and to emphasize the fact that he is the leader, he is the new leader, even b'chayei Moshe. So, if you're trying to lift him up and to elevate him, then why are you naming him Hoshea, his old name? The name that represents his weakness. Them is Rashi Mevayer, and then Rashi answers the question as Yeshua, that this too is part of the quality of Yeshua. That his mind didn't change, that even though he was given greatness, he kept himself low. And in his the nature of the human nature is that a person rises up to a new position. So here the way his conduct changes, according to the new position that he got. Certainly, when you're talking about the leadership of the whole Klal Yisrael, if somebody becomes nasi, it brings out within the person a mode of greatness, of elevation. We're not talking about arrogance or ego, which is not allowed, not in ikdusha gufa, but within holiness. There is a mode of greatness that Torah requires. If a nasi allows himself to be stepped on, then he won't be able to lead. So he has to lift himself up. He has to carry himself as a nasi, even within the qualifications of Torah. Rashi Taka brings that the Eibusha tells Yeshua, take a rod and hit if necessary. So a reference to a pasuk where it says there's kiata tavoi and kiata tavi. You're going to bring, you're going to come. So the Gemara says that Moshe said that kiata tavoi and kiata tavi is a difference between Moshe speaking and Yeshua speaking. Moshe was saying kiata tav. Kiata tavoi means you're coming with them. Kiata tavi means you're leading them. So the Gemara says that Moshe was saying to Yeshua, you'll come with the Skenim. In other words, you'll work with them. And Hashem says, no, kiata tavoi, you're on top of them. Sometimes you have to take a stick and hit them on the head. In other words, that would be the necessary mode. You would think that because he became a leader, you would see within him a tenuah, a mode of hisnasus, of lifting himself up. Das erzählt die Torah as nicht gucken, die gab dem, was man gegeben Yeshua und Gedul. And that's why the Torah says, Hoisheya, because despite the fact that he was given greatness, unerot sicher, bakum besmiches Moshe, ba'ayin yofe, die netike Gedula, visnasas and nasas habin. And certainly, with Moshe's generosity, he was given the necessary greatness that a Nasi needs. Together with that, he carried himself in a way that he was low, like he always was. Just like till that point, he was Moshe's servant, which is a humble life. Even after he was given the greatness, he retained the same humble approach. And that's why Rashi changes the words. Not hu Hoshea b'tzid kasei. This is the same righteous Hoshea. Rashi says more than hu yispil atzmai. He humbled himself. Because the whole point over here is that the pasuk is saying that despite the fact that Yeshua was given greatness, he retained his humility. We could even add on this. It connects to the fact that Rashi brought earlier that Moshe's countenance is like the sun, Yeshua's countenance is like the moon, as Ba'im hat sich ständig angehört, als ist Makabel, wie Levana von dem Shemesh. Even though Yeshua was the leader, it was always seen, it's always obvious that Yeshua was a recipient. He was receiving from Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, he was humble for that. In other words, a person that's bringing his own greatness to the table, that would come with extra hisnasos, with extra elevation. But since Yeshua always retained the fact that he was receiving from his Rebbe, that even after he became Rebbe, and even after he became the Nasi, he was the Makabel. And therefore, and that's what the pasuk says Hoshea. After we're told we're trying to elevate him, why do you say Hoshea? The answer is to tell us that Yeshua always retained his humility even after he had to lead, and he was given leadership, and he was given his nasos, gdul of his nasos from Moshe Rabbeinu. Together with that came an attitude, an approach, a conduct that represented, I'm still a makabel from Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore I'm still humble about this. I can't be too big about myself because I'm a levana. I'm not a chama. Siftes von dem hat man in this brings us a lesson in every single one of us. Geschehen wie es gewinnt bei Yeshua, und als der Achri wird sicher gewinnt zu Gedula, nicht zu Gedula Stamm, nur zu Gedula Neilis Kazu, als hat gehad in Sia Shem Bechaya Moshe, und noch bei der Nefen von der Yuzki. Just like we see by Yeshua, who reached this incredible greatness, not Stamma greatness, but he was leader during Moshe's lifetime, and as an equal to Moshe, is von deswegen gewinnt bei sich, Shafal B'tachas Hashem mit Chilasei. Nevertheless, he retained his humility as he always was, al derech says by Yedin Eden. As Moshe Mesara Yeshua, and the same thing must apply to every single Yid, especially since Moshe gave everything to Yeshua to give to all the Yidden. The B'shas said is Eichet Shal Gadlus and Anin Shal Srara, or that a Gadlus B'shar in Yonim. When a Yid reaches a position of greatness, whether it's greatness because he was given a position of leadership or in any other way. For example, he merited great, beautiful blessings from Hashem. He can think to himself, if Hashem gave me this greatness or these blessings, it's because I'm worthy of it. And this might bring out some sort of a feeling of greatness. Maybe not arrogance, because arrogance is unacceptable, but some sort of feeling of greatness to myself, that look what Hashem gave me. Look what Hashem, obviously it's a bracha from Hashem, I know that, but Hashem chose to give me that bracha, not anyone else. I mean, I'm sure other people too, but I'm saying this specific bracha came to me. So maybe that means that there's something special about me. Learn from Yeshua and as Adarabah. So Yeshua teaches us quite the contrary. Specifically, especially when we reach greatness, we have to retain our humility. And this makes it possible, this creates a possibility that this greatness that we received should remain, should be able to hold itself. If a person gets greatness and it gets to his head and he starts leading in a non-humble way, then people will stop wanting to. Either Hashem will take it away from him, or people will take it away from him. But when a person becomes a leader and at the same time retains his humility, this is the key for him to be able to retain his leadership. This is specifically relevant to Rosh Hashanah, which is very close in time to the time that we read this parsha. The Aveda von Rosh Hashanah is Imru Chulu Shetam Dechuni Aleichem. Eden seine Mamlech dem Eibishter als Melech Yisrael und Melech al Kol Elam Kulei. Rosh Hashanah is the time when Yidden coronate the Eibishter as the king of the Yidden and the king of the world. And since the crowning of Hashem is being done through the work of the Yidden, this shows the importance of the Yid, that he has the power to crown the king. So this might lead to a person to the opposite of humility. Look who I am. I'm the one who is being entrusted and empowered to crown the king. Is Evdam Deira, and therefore there is a lesson from this parsha. As Adarabah, Dafke La'achri V'Iden Tun of Exaggeration Ninyan, from Mamlich Sein dem Eibishter als Melech, right after, Haazinu comes after Rosh Hashanah, right after, we accomplish this incredible accomplishment, that we crowned Hashem as king, that das Hareishnu from Ba'iden Atnu from Bittul B'tachlis Ish Belatzmei. This has to bring out by the Yid a mode of Bittul, to humble oneself, to lower oneself. Because the Eibishter is the king. So how do you worship the king? How do you when you humble yourself to the king? So the lesson is Davka after we were given this power, now we've crowned the Eibishter as king. Now we have to humble ourselves. And when we humble ourselves, then we increase the brachas of Hashem and all that we need. In Haazinu, Gmar Chasim Teva, Lashon Teva Mesuke, Teva Nirav Anigla, Lamata Me'asar Tvachim, Bebon Nechayu, Mazen Nevicha, Ubekulam Nevicha. Should be Haazinu, Gmar Chasim Teva, a good and sweet year in revealed goodness down here in this physical earth, children, health, sustenance, and in all of it in great abundance.